So we've made our way to the end of chapter 4. And again, he's going to die in just a few weeks or a few months, and he knows it. And so it's reflected in the words that he writes in these last words of this last letter to Timothy. And it's heartfelt. There are parts of these last words that just pull and tug at my heart as I read them, and how he really feels about things. And a list of people at the end of this personal letter to Timothy is a reminder that relationships are so important. And it's particularly true when it comes to the Christian community. It is so much easier to serve the Lord when we are serving alongside brothers and sisters in Christ who believe as we believe and act like we act and behave like we behave and hope to live together for all eternity together. So much easier to serve that way, and that's exactly what Paul is going to do in these last words. He's going to mention some people who have been so important to his role and his mission. Timothy, please come as soon as you can. Demas has deserted me because he loves the things of this life and has gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus has gone to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me here in Rome. Bring Mark with you when you come. That's interesting. We'll talk about later. For he will be helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, be sure to bring the coat I left with Carpus at Troas. Also bring my books, especially my papers. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm, and the Lord will judge him for what he has done. Be careful of him, for he fought against everything we said. I don't know, this is such a sad picture to me of the Apostle Paul. He is awaiting death, and he feels alone. This man who wrote over half the New Testament, who established all these churches, who converted thousands of people to the Lord and was a part of their process of salvation, is now awaiting death and feels completely alone. Luke is there, but many of the others have gone on to continue the important work of proclaiming the gospel, as they should have. Paul would not have it any other way. That's exactly what he would want them to do, but the sting to his soul is the aloneness he feels. In verse 16, he talks about facing the judge the first time with nobody by his side. And you can just feel the pain in those words. Can you imagine having the impact throughout his life that the Apostle Paul had? And he's having to stand before the judge with nobody there with him. Nobody backing him up. I mean, it's almost unthinkable. And you can feel the pain in those words. But perhaps some of you know a little bit of what that's like. The pain of feeling like you're alone or standing alone for the Lord. Some college students feel that way when they first leave home and a home church and an environment where they have been nurtured and cared for literally all their life, from the time they were in Sunday school as a toddler all the way up till senior honors day, and they've been protected and loved and nurtured and cared for by the church family and by their own family and by their Christian friends, and then they get tossed onto the campus of a university that is totally secular and humanistic and doesn't even want to hear any alternative views, and they can feel pretty alone. And they might be considered, or may feel like they're being considered, as anti-intellectual and primitive because of their beliefs. When I teach the teenagers next Sunday night I'm going to, this Sunday night for VBS, and one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to challenge them to spend a few minutes, they're on YouTube all the time anyway, so I'm going to challenge them to watch some YouTube videos of a guy named Stephen C. Meyer. So you can too if you would like to. Stephen C. Meyer is one of the world's foremost thought leaders in intelligent design. And I first watched him on a podcast with Joe Rogan, who's very anti-faith, and he just pretty well left Joe Rogan speechless. And so I started studying him even more, and I read his book, Darwin's Doubt. I've read his most recent book, and it's fascinating that anybody could think he is anti-intellectual. So I'm going to challenge them, before you go off to school, you need to watch some things that will fortify and strengthen your faith so that you don't stand alone. Maybe you're a businessman who tries to run your business by Christian principles, but the people who cheat and lie and do subpar work make it very difficult for you to survive because they undercut every bid. Maybe you're part of a family that comes from another religion, one hostile to Christianity, and you stand alone facing the wrath that you feel. That was many of the New Testament Christians in the first century. That's what the book of Hebrews was mostly written about. Maybe you've been discriminated against or picked on because you don't share the same values of people around you, so you've been called narrow-minded or heartless or even a bigot because you believe the Word of God is the one and only non-negotiable truth. Maybe you are, by the way, I left that verse out. The first time I was brought before the judge, no one came with me, everyone abandoned me. May it not be counted against them. Or maybe you're somebody like, when you've been standing alone, like Riley Gaines. I don't know how many of you know the story of Riley Gaines, but she has been in the news a lot the last 3 months because she is a woman swimmer. She was at the University of Kentucky, and her story is unbelievable if you really think about it, because she was denied a 5th place finish in the national tournament in swimming in her particular event because a biological male who had called himself a trans athlete tied with her. And they literally shoved her aside and gave him the trophy and said, there is no trophy available for you, forced her and her other females to dress right next to him in the dressing room. Forced them to. They had no advance notice. They weren't given another place to go. And Riley Gaines, by the way, is a sister in Christ. She grew up in the Old Hickory Church of Christ in Nashville, Tennessee, and is a strong believer, her and her husband both, and she has stood alone. I mean alone. Even other female athletes didn't initially come to her defense. She was standing by herself. And now slowly other female athletes, even professional athletes, have been coming around because one person stood against the entire educational elite system and the entire media system. Because one person stood, others have now started to stand as well. But man, she talks about it a lot. If you watch some interviews with her, how she felt so alone fighting this battle by herself. Or maybe you have felt alone facing the ridicule of friends or coworkers or classmates who try to get you to practice what they believe instead of what you believe. Maybe there's somebody in here that has already been charged with hate speech because you defend Jesus. I know there's one in our congregation that has been. Or the threat of persecution can come from your own family. The pressure is so great that some who were a part of your group may give in and expose the rest of the faith community to persecution. So when Paul says, I stood alone, my heart feels for him and what that must have been like. And so he called for his books, parchments, if you're reading in the New King James, or my papers, and his coat. Why did he need a coat? Because it's getting cold. And by the way, it may have been one of the only luxuries that he owned. He had been traveling for his ministry his entire adult life, and it may have been one of the last luxuries that he had was just a coat that could keep him warm in those dark dungeon cells of the Maritime prison. So he wants his coat and he wants his books or his word. Maybe the books were the written accounts of the words of Jesus that he's asking for. One thing is sure, most preachers love their books. I have and do. And he wanted his too. And then he said, only Luke is with me. Bring Mark with you when you come, for he will be helpful to me in my ministry. That's an interesting phrase, if you know the background here. Mark is an interesting story. His mother's home was one of the earliest meeting places of the church in Jerusalem. Some believe this was the same home where the Last Supper took place. Mark had been, for all of his life, an eyewitness to the life of Jesus. He probably was the young man who ran away naked at the arrest of Jesus that is described in Mark chapter 14, because he's the one who wrote the account. And when he didn't name it, most scholars have believed he was talking about himself. When Paul went on his first missionary journey with Barnabas, he and Barnabas took Mark with them. But for some reason, Mark left them, went home early. We don't know why. Later, Barnabas wanted to take Mark on a second missionary journey with him, and Paul said, no way, Jose. Or at least no way, Mark. He's not going. He cannot come. And Barnabas so wanted to take him that they split into two teams. A split between Paul, who had stood for Barnabas, and Barnabas had stood for Paul in the first century church, and really caused the first century church to believe that he truly had been converted. Barnabas was as influential in that as anybody. And now these two men are being split in their second missionary journey. That's how strongly Paul felt about not taking Mark. Now, it turned out to be a good thing, because now you had two mission teams going on the second journey. Paul took Silas with him, and Barnabas took Mark with him. But still there's this rift where he wouldn't let Mark go with him. He didn't think he was trustworthy. But now, here he is, at the end of his life. And Paul has changed his mind about Mark. He has become a trusted colleague. According to Colossians chapter 4, he was with Paul during his first imprisonment. In Philemon 24, Paul calls Mark his beloved co-worker. Mark later went on to author the gospel that bears his name. It's an amazing story. What happened between the two of them on that first missionary journey? We don't know. Why did he leave? We don't know. Why would Paul not bring him back? We don't know. There's so much we don't know. Let's not forget that Paul had been known as Saul. He used to be a terrorist. Literally a terrorist. Persecuting the church and having Christians killed. He was, if you will, the Osama bin Laden of the Jewish establishment. And when Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, he had a dramatic change of heart. But not all the believers believed and trusted that. And it's hard to blame them. You don't think that's true? What if the SEAL 6 mission team had not actually killed Osama bin Laden, but they had brought him to America, and the American justice system had released him? I can believe that. Can you? And the American justice system released him, and he walked in the back door tonight and came down here and sat on the second row. We'd recognize him, don't you think? And he said that he had changed his mind about Americans and he'd changed his mind about Jesus. Where once he had hated Americans and once he had hated Christians, he now had deep respect for them. Would you believe him? And not only that, would you embrace him so much that you said, I want you to come to my house and spend the night tonight? Not me. You might be that brave, but not me. And would you then say, we're going to raise a lot of money to spend you on a speaking tour and to go around and try to convert other Christians? I think that'd take a long time to happen. I think the first thing we'd think is, I'm scared. The second thing we'd think is, nobody changes that dramatically. The third thing we'd think is, can I get to my car before he kills me? You don't think the New Testament Christians felt the same way when Saul, in the early weeks, entered their homes and their synagogues? Absolutely they did. People don't change. He doesn't deserve an opportunity to prove he's a different man. But here's the thing. That is exactly what happened to Paul. The terrorist Jew became the church's greatest and most influential teacher in history, authoring half of the New Testament. We study his words and marvel at them. We have been for the last 3 months. We will be for the next month or so. He's an amazing story of God's great grace and ability to transform a life. And so I think here in the last days of his life, Paul was able to believe that Mark had become a different man because he had become a different man. That's so important for us to know. I think the people who have had to change the most themselves are the people who are most open to the changes other people can make. Maybe that's what's happening here when he says, bring Mark with you because he's important to me. We must never forget that if God can change the course of our lives, he can change the course of anybody's life. It's true that some change is superficial. Some people can fool us, but some of it isn't. Why not dare to side on the side of grace? The next passage shows us some people help and some people hinder, because Paul mentions a bunch of different people in these verses, and in the middle of them, he talks about a man named Demas, who was a source of tremendous discouragement to Paul. He let him down. How did he do that? Well, I grew up memorizing the old King James Version where it says, for Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world. Right, John? For Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world. In the newer translations, it says he loved the things of the world more than spiritual things. And he deserted Paul, and we're told it's because he liked too much of the glitz. His head was turned by all the stuff, all the power, all the amusements of this world. When we love the wrong things, we will live the wrong life. That's always true. What we love really reveals everything about us. It does. And so, he forsook Paul, abandoned him. It's tough to invest deeply in someone and learn to trust them, only to have them turn away and hurt you. It's probably, after all these years in ministry, 50 years now in ministry, it's probably, if you ask me, the hardest thing that I have to deal with, the hardest struggle I have to deal with is that very thing myself. That you've worked so hard with people, you've tried so hard with people, you've baptized them, you've loved them, you've prayed with them, you've been there in their crisis, you've worshiped with them, and then they leave you for somewhere else. And it's so common in today's world, particularly in churches. There's so much church hopping going on. And it's probably the most painful thing that most any preacher actually faces. But some people do worse than that. Some people don't just leave you. Some people try to harm you, which was one in the text. Alexander, the coppersmith, did me much harm. Be careful of him. He fought against everything we said. So apparently, Alexander was never really a friend of Paul's, and he did Paul a lot of harm. Some people suggest he may have actually been involved in Paul's arrest. He may have been in behind the scenes. He had been an idol maker previously, and maybe Paul had caused him to lose business. Now, there is another Alexander way back in the beginning in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 20, that Paul also mentioned and said he had delivered him to Satan. That's about as harsh a thing as you could say. And we don't know if this is the same Alexander, but it probably is. But we don't know that for sure. But Paul has two things to say about him. The Lord's going to judge him for sure. The Lord is the one who vindicates his people. We must never forget that we think people are getting by with sin, and they're not. The Lord will judge them. And he also told Timothy, in effect, paraphrasing, watch your back. Watch your back. Don't have anything to do with this guy. I've known people like that myself in churches. Watch your back. Be very careful. It's important that we recognize that different people are in different stages of not only their relationship with God and their relationship with the church, but they're in different phases or relationships of their life. And sometimes people have going on in their life something that is so overwhelming that it carries over into their relationships in the church. You've heard me say this many times. It's hurt people that hurt people. And sometimes when somebody is hurting in another area of their life, it carries over into their relationships in the church as well. So he's simply saying, watch your back with this guy. There are always people that talk a good game, but when it comes to a time of conflict, they're not interested in resolving conflict. They want to win. One of the things I've always emphasized in church, particularly churches here, is unity. Unity. I mean, the one thing that will get our elders dander up very quick is any attempt at disunity. It has several times, and as a result, we have withdrawn from a handful of people over the 40 years that I've been here. We have confronted and encouraged to leave other people if they were threatening the unity of the church, because the unity of the church is so important. And many reasons why churches remain small and have not done well is they have not emphasized that point. They have not made sure that they resolved conflict. And if you have people who, when there's conflict, they want to win, they can be dangerous rather than to resolve. In dealing with conflict, you always need to look for win-win situations, not win-lose situations, because the lose side of that is going to create trouble. Verse 19 begins this way, 17. But the Lord stood with me and gave me strength, so that I might preach the good news in its entirety for all the Gentiles to hear. And he rescued me from certain death. Yes, and the Lord will deliver me from every evil attack and will bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. All glory to God forever and ever. So then he goes on and gives greetings to a couple of names that are familiar to us from the book of Acts. Priscilla and Aquila, and those living in the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus stayed at Corinth. I left Trophimus sick at Miletus. He also mentions him in Philippians. And then he says one of the most interesting verses in the book. Do your best to get here before winter. In the old King James Version, it simply says, come before winter. Now, that's such an interesting phrase. Above everything else, he wanted Timothy to come see him in person before he died. Now remember that Timothy is in Ephesus, hundreds of miles away, 800 miles away to be precise. And it would take several months for him to come to Rome. But the aging apostle wanted his young friend to come one last time before he died. And I don't know how much you've been paying attention to this throughout the course of chapter 4, because We did the first half of chapter 4 weeks ago now. But let me just remind you, this is the fourth time Paul is going to say that in just the fourth chapter alone. In verse 9, he said, do your best to come to me quickly. In verse 11, he said, get Mark and bring him with you. He said, when you come, bring the cloak that I left. When you come, not if you come, when you come. And now he says, come before winter. Do your best to get here before winter. Timothy, if you're going to come at all, for the fourth time, come now. Don't wait. Don't delay. I won't be alive much longer. Come quickly, my friend. You see, some things must be done before winter or they will not be done at all. There are doors of opportunity that open before us today that if we don't take advantage of them, by springtime of our life, they will be shut. You can't wait forever to respond to things that are important. Shakespeare once said, there is a tide in the affairs of men which, when taken at flood, leads to fortune. Timothy, make sure you come quickly. Come now. He knows exactly what is about to happen. And he doesn't care that he's about to die. In the last half of this chapter we just studied, the last lesson, he already said, for the time of my departure is now at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. Therefore there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, has promised me, and not to me only, but to all those who love his appearing. He knows he's about to die. He's already said he's not afraid to die. He's ready to die. He knows where he's going, but he doesn't want to die alone. Well, who does? It's one of those fears we hardly ever talk about. We hardly ever talk about dying, period. But it lurks around every corner. And we know it's coming. Even though we hardly ever talk about dying. But talking about dying alone? Nobody wants to do that. We want somebody with us. Somebody who loves us. Somebody who cares for us. And here's an important question. Did Timothy go? I don't know. We don't know. We're not told. But this much is certain. We do know procrastination destroys many good intentions. I do know many marriages die more from neglect than they do from deliberate desertion. I do know more relationships are destroyed by neglect than they are by angry words. I do know more of our neighbors and friends at work and family members die lost without the Lord because at some point we intended to be serious about our Christian faith and share Jesus with them, but never quite got there. Come before winter. Come now. But really, that's not even the biggest question. Did Timothy go? Do you know what the biggest question is? Would you go? That's down where the rubber meets the road. That's where we start to make application of these verses that we read. Would you go? So I'm going to tell you a very personal story that I've never told before because it's so personal. And I debated telling it now, and it's not going to make me look so good. But that's not the reason I haven't told it. It's just a reality. My father developed lung cancer in 1974 and had 8 surgeries for lung cancer all the way through the 70s and all the way through the 80s. He, at one point, was the longest surviving. They took half of one lung in 1974. And at one point, he was the longest surviving patient who had lost a half of an entire lung, because that was new technology back then in 1974. And so he was in and out of the hospital for years. We moved here in 1984. He was about as good as he could be through that when we moved. But about 1987, he started to slide a little bit downhill again and had 2 or 3 more hospitalizations and problems and surgeries. And I went for both of those. And then in 1989, he started to get much worse. And so I called my mother and my brother and said, I'm just going to come up there and stay for a week or 2. And I went up there in February of 1989. It's a great memory. We watched the Super Bowl together. I took him down to my brother's home. I made him get out and go some places, even though all he really wanted to do was stay in the bed. And then in May of that year, amazingly, he made a trip here to see his grandkids play baseball. And we took him out. I still remember we took him out on the Sanibel Causeway. He couldn't really go to the beach, but we sat a beach chair out there and let him sit there for a minute. And when he got on the plane, I remember as we watched them walk toward the ramp, I thought this might be the last time I ever see him. And on June 14th, about a month after that, my mother had taken him to the hospital on a Monday, and she called, and I said, well, is it serious? And she said, I'm not sure. And I said, well, I'll call back tonight. And I called back that night, and I said, Daddy, should I come? Do you think I should come? And he said, as he would always say, no, don't come. Really, you've got a lot to do there. You got to pull. And I did. I mean, I was at a job, I was preaching at the church. I had a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, had a family, a lot of responsibilities, and 850 miles away, although I'd gone other times. And he said, no. I said, well, how do you feel? And he said, I think I'll probably go home in 2 or 3 days. I think they'll treat me and I'll go home in 2 or 3 days. I said, okay. So we talked about it that night, and I didn't go. And the next day, he died. And I was not there. And I think deep down it has always really bothered me that I had the opportunity to come before winter, and I didn't. Now, I'm not trying to compare the death of one man with what Paul is writing here, but I am trying to say there are some things that if you don't do them when you have the opportunity to do them, the door's going to shut and you'll never have that opportunity again. So if you can do it, do it. Did Timothy go when Paul 4 times said, I hope you'll come. I hope you'll bring Mark. I hope you'll bring my coat. I hope you'll bring my books. And I hope you'll come before winter. Because the implication there is if you don't come before winter, you'll never see me again, Timothy. Did he go? We don't know. Does it even matter? Not much, 2,000 years later. But it matters in every one of our lives, whether we do, with the things that are really important in life.